Hello, you have seen some 3 videos from me now on the topic of leadership ethics. The first 3 videos were focused more on the lack of ethics or more on immorality. We were trying to understand the nature of bad leadership, the nature of unethical leadership. That was what my first video was about. Then in the next 2 videos I discussed why do we see bad leadership or unethical leadership? Why is it that good people engage in bad behavior? We discussed the personality, motivational and decision making factors as well as contextual factors that contribute to the occurrence of bad leadership. Now in this video we will make a major shift in our discussion. Instead of focusing on immorality or unethical behavior or unethical decision making or unethical leaders, we will focus on ethics. One of the factors that we discussed in my last video about why there is the existence of immoral leaders is because leaders aren't even aware of what morality is, what a good ethical decision should look like, what an ethical action should look like. So if they do not have the necessary knowledge and skills about what ethics is, what good ethical decision making is, or what good ethical action is, then they will not be able to function as ethical leaders. So in this video, the focus is on understanding the varied ethical perspectives or ethical theories or theories of ethics that we have. And I will go over some of the main theories of ethics. These different theories try to understand ethics from different perspectives naturally, but each of these perspectives provides some great insights about what ethics is or what morality is, and not just that, it provides great insights about how we can be more ethical and moral individuals, how a leader can be more ethical. So with that brief background, let's start diving deeper into the topic. But even before I go over the different ethical theories or ethics theories, I would like to provide you some statistics about how important ethics is in leadership, in business contexts. So let's start with some of those statistics. The first slide that you see here is the amount of money that is spent in developing leaders. So corporations spend billions of dollars every year. This data is only up to 2012, but we see that corporations spend literally billions of dollars every year to develop leadership skills, leadership competencies in their leaders. And we are seeing an increasing trend here, right? The amount of money that corporations have been spending every year has been increasing at an exponential rate. This is all good. But if we see some other statistics, this is statistics about how confident are people about their leaders. Do they trust their leaders or do they not trust their leaders? And what we see here, this is data from the Harris poll, and you see over the years people's confidence in leaders have been declining, and this is happening at varying rate in corporations, Wall Street, and in governments. But overall, we still see there's a decline across all the sectors. This is, of course, data only about United States, but there is probably no reason to suspect that the trends in other parts of the world are dramatically different from what we see here. So the same graph that you saw in the last slide, if we take an average across those three sectors of corporations, Wall Street, and governments, we see there is an overall decline in people's confidence in their leaders. People do not trust their leaders as much. So if at one point of time 90% of the people had confidence, had trust in their leaders, now meaning in 2012, now it may have been worse. The confidence seems to be in about 60%. That's a 30% decline, which is a major decline in the level of trust that people have in leaders. That's problematic. And if you contrast that with the graph that I had shown earlier about the amount of money that is spent in leadership training, in leadership development, we see a huge problem. On one hand, corporations or organizations are spending more and more dollars on leadership development, on improving the competencies of leaders, and yet we are seeing there's a decline in the level of confidence that people have in their leaders. So obviously then we are not doing the leadership development training programs right. Maybe we are focusing on the wrong things when we are training leaders. There could be numerous factors that may be coming into play, but I would suspect that a lot of the training that we see happening focuses more on developing leaders' competencies, skills, about how they can be more effective. But maybe, and this is a big problem, maybe enough emphasis is not being given to the area of ethics. That's the reason people do not trust their leaders as much, right? You can be a competent leader, but if you are an unethical leader, you still end up being a bad leader. You still end up taking decisions that are not good for the employees or the community or the environment, and then these people will not trust you anymore, right? So, but what I shared with you seems to be just one data point, but that's not the case. This was a study that was published from the Harvard University, the Kennedy School, same place where Barbara Kellerman used to work. And this is a little dated. This is from 2012 National Leadership Index, the report that this university had published. So they went about asking people about how much of again trust they have for the leaders. And what we see is that the majority, if you look at these different parts of the graph, you see majority 69 to 70% based on the specific question that is being asked do not trust the leaders, whereas we see that 68% or the majority do see the importance of of trust in leadership. But what we see is that currently when this study had been done, there is a lack of trust in leaders. And this is not just two studies, there are numerous other studies. This is data from the Gallup organization, and they do lot of long-term opinion surveys, and here also we see decline in the leadership trust on in the area of mass media, right? Here we see declining trust in leadership working in governments. And here we have data from a much longer period. This is Pew Research data. You can see there has been a huge decline in the level of trust that people have in government leaders. So from 1958 to 2015, a long data scale, and that's what we are seeing. And the next second part of the graph, you see that same data separated by different generations, and we see overall similar pattern, right? Across generations there is less trust in the leaders. Even based on political affiliation, if we look at the data here, again this is only United States data, but we see irrespective of what political affiliation the leaders have, Republican or Democrat, there has been an overall decline in the level of trust that people have in their leaders. So with this background, I hope you understand how important ethics or morality is when it comes to leadership. Sometimes you may be extremely competent person who graduated from the topmost university. You may be working in the most prestigious of the companies, and that means, based on the training that you have had as a leader, let's say you graduated from Harvard or Stanford or Yale, but just because you have all the necessary credentials does not automatically mean that people will trust you as a leader. So along with your credentials, along with your competencies, skills that you have, we need to have trust in your character, in your capacity and willingness to take ethical and moral decisions, to take the right actions, right? So when this does not happen, it actually impacts businesses in a very negative way, and there's data about it as well, which you can see here. So when leaders lack in ethics, it's actually not good for the business. It may seem to the leader like it is good for the business because they are being able to take some shortcuts and excuse me, make some quick easy money, but in the fairly short term as well, or in the long term, definitely it turns out to be bad for business. So because of this lack of trust, we see that people start leaving the company, or they stop buying things from the company, and a whole host of other things that you can see here. So bad ethics is bad for business. Now you can understand, hopefully, the importance of ethics in leadership, the importance of ethics in business. When people aren't ethical, it leads to we not trusting those leaders. So how then can we become more ethical? That's the big question, right? And to understand that, now we will go through the most important ethics theories that have been proposed over the past few centuries. And it is indeed the case that if we internalize some of these ethics theories, then we actually can be more ethical leaders. So here's a breakup of the different theories that we will be discussing. So all the ethics theories, they can be broadly divided into two categories. You can see this from the mind map that I am sharing here. So ethics theories are either conduct focused or character focused. So what are conduct focused ethics theories? a conduct-focused ethics theory focuses on the action. It tries to understand which action is ethical, which action is moral, and which actions aren't ethical and moral, right? So these theories provide insights about that, about understanding which actions are ethical, which actions are not ethical. Whereas the character-focused theories, they do not give as much importance to actions. They emphasize the person conducting those actions, right? So the person behind those actions, what are the person's intentions, what kind of character the person has. Because again, you can imagine somebody may act in a very ethical or moral fashion in one situation does not automatically mean that the person is of a good, strong, positive, ethical character, right? The person may have behaved in an ethical manner because of numerous reasons. Could be because of contextual factors, could be because of even highly selfish reasons. So just because an action is right or moral does not automatically mean that the character of the person is good, right? So these are the two broad categories of theories that we will be discussing. Now, within the conduct focused theories, we then have two again major categories of theories. The first one are the teleological theories, also known as consequentialist kind of theories. Teleological, tele means what? Distance. So, or consequence, of course, you know the word consequence, it means what happens. So all the teleological theories, they decide what is right and what is wrong based on the consequence of the actions. And consequence does not can happen a little later. So the merits of the action is decided based on the consequence, what happens after your actions. When the consequence of your actions are good, then we say that you have been moral. When your consequence of your actions have been bad, then we say that your action is immoral. Okay. Within that, again, we have three different categories of theories, which we will go through one by one. But before I go into those three different categories of theories, or those three different theories, let's quickly touch upon the deontological theories, because the deontological theories, being part of the conduct focused theories, are also theories that focus on action. So these theories, they decide which action is right and which action is wrong based on the merits of the action and not based on the consequence. So teleological theories, we decide which action is good and bad, or which action is right and wrong based on the consequence of the actions. Whereas deontological theories, they say, the consequence can be anything. Sometimes an action could be immoral, but the consequence of that action could be positive. Then should we say that the immoral action is now moral, right? And vice versa. Sometimes an action may be moral, but the consequence may be negative. Does that mean that that moral action is immoral now, right? A quick example that comes to mind is, let's say a surgeon is performing a surgery. The surgeon cuts open the person's stomach, and he's a very competent surgeon, everything, but despite all his efforts, the person dies. So the consequence of the surgery was that the person dies, a negative outcome. Does that mean that performing surgery is an immoral action? No, right? And on the opposite spectrum, let's say a ruffian tries to stab a guy, and the and here again the person is using a knife to cut through somebody's stomach, but in that case the person survives, uh, maybe even has some other positive consequences in terms of, let's say, getting compensation from the government or something. So the consequence of that stabbing action turned out to be pretty positive for the person who was stabbed. Does not automatically mean that this stabbing action was moral or ethical, right? So these are the two different approaches through which we decide which action is moral and which action is immoral. Now, based on the discussion that we have had so far, it may seem like deontological theories are better than teleological theories. To a certain extent, that may be the case, but that's not necessarily always the case. So both the teleological theories as well as the deontological theories have merits, and that's what we will go through now. We will start with going through each of the teleological theories now. So what you see here are those three teleological theories that I had shared before in the mind map. Here I am sharing them in a matrix. So in the matrix, on the x-axis, you have concern for the interest of others. So how much do you care for others, their needs? So it could be low, it could be medium, it could be high. Okay. Similarly, on the y-axis, we have concern for self. So it's all about self-interest. So how much do I care about me, about my needs, about my interests? So with that in mind, we then have these three different theories of ethics. Ethical egoism says that if the consequence of your action benefits me, benefits the self, then it is ethical. Altruism, on the other hand, says an action is ethical if it benefits others. And then we have utilitarianism, which tries to not go into either of those extremes and tries to find a balance between the two. It tries to, as much as possible, maximize not only the self-interest but also the interest of others. So, but across all these theories, the way we define the action to be right is based on the consequence of those actions. Now we will go through each of these theories in greater detail. So again, you see this mind map that you had seen before. Ethical egoism, utilitarianism, and altruism, they all come under teleological theories, but we will go through ethical egoism in greater detail. So what is ethical egoism? It's this theory, this idea. Again, by theory, we are essentially seeing the point of view. Okay, so it is this point of view according to which individuals are being moral or individuals are being ethical when they work in their self-interest, when their actions benefit them. So if you prioritize your own needs, if you give importance to fulfilling your own desires, that's the ethical thing to do. And the basic idea is that we are all inherently motivated to work for our self-interest. There is nothing wrong with that. So the idea of ethical egoism is that we should all be working for our own self-interest, and that's a very ethical thing to do. Now, many of us may think that's a horrible thing to say. It's essentially promoting selfishness. It is promoting greed. And if everyone engages in such ethical egoism, then we will essentially have complete degradation, disintegration of our society. And there are numerous examples of that happening. When a business owner is, let's say, pursuing profits at all costs, then we usually don't think that to be ethical, but here ethical egoism is saying that to be ethical, right? So that seems a little problematic. Or for that matter, even in a personal life, if I am pursuing just my happiness, my life fulfillment exclusively, and not fulfilling the obligations that I have for my other family members, we typically will not call it an ethical thing. And yet the theory here says that that's the right thing to do. So this can become very confusing. But if you think deeper, you will also find situations where ethical egoism, this perspective, does have certain merits. So when we are saying that working for one's self-interest, doing those actions that are good for us is the right thing to do, it is the moral thing to do, you would agree that that would be the case when I am, let's say, working on my self-development. Let's say I have a good disciplined life where I sleep on time, get adequate sleep, eat healthy, and exercise regularly. These are things that are good for me, right? And I engage in these activities. Then you would say, yes, that's a moral thing. Because if I'm doing the opposite, let's say I drink a lot of alcohol, or maybe even do drugs or smoke, and I'm just sitting on the couch watching junk stuff on the TV, then you would say that is immoral. So now you can see, we see a case where ethical egoism is actually good. So working in our own self-interest is not necessarily bad. When we take care of ourselves, or even when I'm pursuing my passion, let's say an artist pursues his passion or her passion because that's what gives him or her satisfaction, we say that's a good thing, right? So the point here is, do not automatically discard the idea of ethical egoism as unethical, as immoral, though there are some merits to the criticism that the idea of ethical egoism receives, and that should get clear in this matrix diagram that I had shared with you before. So having high concern for one's self is not necessarily bad, but if that is the only thing that I have, if I only have that extreme high concern for my needs, my interests, and not any high concern for the interests and needs of others, if I do not take that into account, then it becomes unethical. But just doing things for one's own self is not automatically unethical, right? As long as I also have high concern for others, for the needs, for the interests of others, as long as I take even actions for their benefit, for the benefit for the others, as long as I'm fulfilling my obligations for others, then ethical egoism is not automatically bad. So ethical egoism receives a lot of flack, but there still are merits, because we do see a lot of behavior in our society that actually are behaviors that harm ourselves, in form of all kinds of behaviors. And actions and inactions. Actions in form of engaging in different addictive behaviors, or inactions in form of not engaging in the behaviors that are good for us. So all those things are actually immoral because we are harming ourselves. The consequence of those actions are not good for us. They are not good for our mental and physical well-being. So we can consider those actions as immoral. Now, in this diagram, of course, the next is utilitarianism, but I think it will be easier to discuss utilitarianism if I start first of all with altruism, which is a much simpler theory anyway. So altruism is this idea of we having high concern for others. And it is not just, again, because these are teleological theories, it's not just about having that concern or intention of caring for others, but actually doing those actions. So when our actions are for the benefit of others, even at a personal cost, then we consider those actions to be moral. So most people would say that's yes, those actions are extremely moral actions, because here we are taking care of others, we have concern for others, so we are doing things for the benefit of others. But again, if you contrast this with ethical egoism, it's the same way ethical egoism becomes problematic if we only have concern for ourselves and not for others. The same argument could also be made, at least in extreme cases, when we only have concern for others, when our actions only benefit others and not ourselves, right? That can be immoral, that could be considered unethical, because extreme forms of altruism may not even be sustainable, right? I cannot only be giving, after a while I will run out of the resources. I cannot only be taking care of others at the cost, especially if that's happening at the cost of my own well-being. If I do not take care of myself, then I will not be able to take care of others optimally. That's the reason on the aircraft they say, when the pressure drops, the oxygen masks will drop, but you need to they say that you have to put the mask on yourself first and then help anyone else sitting next to you, because again, if you pass out because of not having adequate oxygen, then you will not be able to help your kid who needs oxygen at that point of time. So you have to put the mask on yourself, and then as long as you are getting the oxygen, then you would be able to help others in need, right? So that's the kind of idea that we are talking about here. Your textbook talks about different forms of altruism. Altruism just directed at one person, that would be individual focused, or it could be altruism towards your entire team, that would be group focused, or altruistic behaviors directed towards the entire organization, that would be organization focused. Altruism directed towards the society, that's society focused. And your textbook also talks about toxin handlers. So it's not just about helping others, but taking the pain of others yourself, right? So you absorb the pain that or the difficulties that others have. So that's about altruism, but hopefully you realize that altruism, yes, it is a very noble form of it's a very noble idea, but it has its demerits as well, right? Especially if we only talk about altruism in form of motives, that becomes highly problematic. That's thankfully not the case when we talk about altruism in the teleological sense, in the consequentialist view, because there we are talking in terms of the actual benefits accruing from those actions. But many people, they claim to be highly altruistic, they profess themselves to be altruistic, when in reality they aren't. So just because somebody is talking a lot about being altruistic, or professes himself or herself to be altruistic, does not automatically mean that they are actually altruistic in form of the actions that they perform, right? So that's something that we have to be extremely be careful about. And excuse me, altruism taken to the extreme can also be problematic. So that then brings us to the idea of utilitarianism. Now, this is one of the most, if not the most, but amongst the top theories of ethics. This was propounded in the 1700s, 1800s by Jeremy Bentham and by John Stuart Mill, and there have been other important figures as well. But the idea here does a good balancing between ethical egoism and altruism, because the idea is that what is moral is not just about benefiting the self or benefiting others. Rather, it is the idea of trying to maximize the benefit for everyone concerned. So it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So that's the idea. This theory can focus on a specific action, whether a specific action is moral or immoral. In that case, if that's what the theory is focusing on, then it becomes an action or act utilitarianism. Or if it is a generic rule, then that would apply to many different actions in many different contexts, then we call it rule-based utilitarianism. Either way, the idea is that we are trying to maximize the happiness amongst people. So there are some main precepts in the idea of utilitarianism. First of all, it's a hedonistic point of view, in the sense that it gives a lot of emphasis on happiness, on pleasure. So what you are trying to maximize across people is their happiness, is their pleasure. So as long as you are succeeding as long as your actions are maximizing happiness in a larger number of people, then we will say that your actions are moral. Or it could be the opposite of happiness too, when it is described in the negative terms. So all those actions that is minimizing pain, minimizing harm across the maximum number of people, those actions are moral. So that is the basic idea in utilitarianism. So that's the right thing to do. And again, as I have been emphasizing both in the ethical egoism and altruism, this is a consequentialist theory or a teleological theory. In other words, it's not just about intention, but whether your actions actually benefit the largest number of people possible. Then we call this to be fitting the utilitarian idea of ethics. Now the point about impartiality is again extremely important. So we do not give more weight to the happiness of self versus the happiness of others. So everyone gets equal weight when it comes to the idea of impartiality in utilitarianism. So let's say I'm trying to maximize the happiness of, let's say I have 10 members in the family. So it's not that my happiness carries more weight than the happiness of all the other 10 members, all the other 9 members in the family. So everyone carries equal weight. So only those actions will be considered more ethical, that is maximizing happiness of the maximum number of people. And it is not about giving preferential treatment to some people, or even that some people could be even include yourself, right? So when we are talking about maximizing happiness, or the greatest good for the greatest number of people, we are not saying that it has to be that those people should include me and my immediate loved ones. No, we try to maximize happiness of as many number of people as possible. Now, you can imagine this can become a very difficult calculation. So that's the reason the term utilitarian calculus comes into play. It can become very complex calculation. How do we figure out how many people are getting benefited, and to what extent? So because it takes into account whole host of factors, the number of people that exist, and even when we are talking about happiness or reduction in pain, for we have to talk about the intensity, about the duration, about um, also the potential of happiness. So a potential of happiness in terms of subjectivity, right? When we are talking about happiness, there's a subjective element involved there. Even if we are giving equal importance to the happiness of every person, one person may value that much more than another person. So it becomes a very difficult kind of calculation. Though there are certain ways through which we can probably make this calculation a little easier, and I will talk about it. But before we go in there, we should probably discuss few examples of the utilitarian philosophy. This philosophy of trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So let's say you are a physician working at a hospital that is treating COVID patients. Imagine during the initial stages of the COVID pandemic, when there were scarce resources. So you had to take some decisions about whom, in which patient you invest your energy and resources. Should you be investing more energy on based on the sequence the patients come in, or should you invest your energy and resources based on who are most likely to survive, right? So these are difficult decisions. So what utilitarian philosophy would say is that the moral thing would be to maybe not spend too much of your time, energy, those time, energy, and the even the medicines and the facilities, let's say the ventilator and all those resources on patients who are have a greater likelihood of not surviving. So your approach needs to be such that you will be succeeding in successfully treating the maximum number of people, or in other words, you can maximize the number of survivors. So that would be the right approach to treating patients. And this is something that happens even on the battleground, right? And there are patients, patients, let's say, coming in, and you have minimal resources. Should you be investing, giving away all your resources to save one patient who is critically injured, is unlikely to survive? Or should you distribute those minimal resources you have with other patients so that more number of people survive? And these are difficult, hard decisions. But utilitarianism need not come into play only in such rare situations. In fact, almost everything that you see in our life is most of the policy decisions are based on utilitarian thought, utilitarian philosophy. When we are trying to reduce the environmental impact of our product, That's a utilitarian idea, because we want to minimize the harm that we are causing to so many people and the environment here. Even, let's say, a simple decision of whether we should increase the speed limit on a particular highway, that's again a utilitarian kind of thinking that has to go into play. Let's say for every 5 mile per hour or 10 mile per hour increase in the speed limit that we do, we may cause greater happiness in people, but there is the flip side. We may also see greater number of accidents. So there is a balancing act that we are trying to do. We are trying to make decisions where more people are likely to be happy, and there is lesser likelihood of accidents, right? So we are the greater the increase in speed limit, the more happiness people can reach their destinations faster, and maybe they will also get a greater thrill from driving faster on the highway. But there will be few people who would be getting killed, right? And maybe because of these accidents there will be greater delay also on these highways, which then is reducing the happiness that people would have derived from actually reaching their destinations faster. So there's a balancing act that you are trying to do. You are trying to find that optimal stage where maximum number of people will be happy and minimum number of people will be unhappy, or minimum number of people will be harmed. So that's the kind of thinking that goes into utilitarianism. Now, the process of trying to figure out whether a particular action is ethical or not, of course, is very complex in utilitarian thinking or utilitarian philosophy. But one can still do that if you have good clarity about the different steps that are involved in that process of calculation. So the first thing that you need to do is to specify the action that you are evaluating. For example, if you are trying to figure out whether you, as the manager of a apartment complex, let's say you are deciding to increase the rent of the tenants by 10%, is that an ethical thing to do, or is that an unethical thing to do? You have to first of all specify what action we are talking about. We are talking about the action of increasing the rent by 10%. So have complete clarity about what particular action we are talking about, what particular scheme we are talking about. You may be the HR manager of an organization. You may be coming up with a particular retirement plan, let's say, okay, or you may be coming up with a scheme of laying off 20 people or 10% of the workforce. So again, we need to have clarity about what exactly we are talking about, which particular action we are talking about. Once you have clarity about that, then comes the second step, which is to identify all the people who would be impacted by your action or by your decision. You have to identify everyone. It could be just people in your immediate team, it could be people beyond your team, people in other departments, people in the entire organization, people in organization outside your country, maybe your customers, it could be people who live in your community. So in other words, you try to identify everyone who would be impacted by your decision. And then comes the step of determining whether each and every one of those person would benefit from your decision, or are they going to be negatively impacted by your decision. Are they going to be happy by your decision, or are they going to be unhappy by your action? And you do this for everyone who would be impacted by your decision. And then when you do a summation of all that positive and negative impact, you will be able to figure out whether your decision was recommended based on the utilitarian philosophy or whether it is not recommended as per the utilitarian thinking. So if you have a net positive, that means more number of people are benefiting from it than getting harmed by it. So then it becomes an ethical action from a utilitarian philosophy. If you are having a net negative, that means more people are getting harmed by it than benefiting. So it becomes an unethical action based on the utilitarian philosophy. Now, as I said, this is not always as easily calculated, especially when we are talking about decisions that impacts not just few handful of people but thousands or maybe tens of thousands or maybe even millions of people. Of course, you cannot go about taking a survey of each and every one of those people and how they would be impacted, but you can imagine you can still do this calculation maybe by doing a sampling of a survey, or at least conceptually knowing how different groups would be impacted by your decision or by your action, and based on how many people are there in different groups, again you can then do the summation of the net impact, and that's how you figure out whether your decision or action is ethical or unethical. But utilitarian thinking is still pretty complex, and it's not always easy to identify, especially the consequences and how to evaluate those consequences. There can be a lot of subjectivity involved. Are we talking about the objective consequence or are we talking about the subjective consequence, right? The objective consequence may be positive, but the subjective consequence may be negative, and so on and so forth. There can be a lot of complexities that come into this calculation process, which then makes this theory too complex and not very practical or not very beneficial. That said, a lot of the decisions that are actually taken in the business organizations or by the government do use the utilitarian model of thinking, because it does have tremendous benefits in terms of this idea of maximizing the benefits for maximum number of people and minimizing the harm for minimum number of people. So one of the biggest criticisms though of utilitarian thinking is that we treat people as means to the bigger objective that we have, and that's not a good thing, right? When we are, let's say, taking a decision that harms only 5 people but benefits 100 people, from a utilitarian philosophy, it's a very good thing to do, because it's harming way more number of people than it is benefiting way more number of people than it is harming. Yet what's happening here is that we are using these 5 people as a means to benefit the bigger number of people, which then is potentially unethical, right? So, and this has been criticized by numerous people, giving numerous examples. But one of the most common examples that is shared in the literature is that of the trolley problem. This is a fascinating problem where a hypothetical scenario is described where a trolley is, uncontrolled trolley is running down a track, and there are 5 people tied on to the track. So if the trolley continues to move on that track, it's going to run over them and kill all those 5 people. But there is a deviation from the track which is controlled by a lever. On that secondary track, there is only one person tied to the track. Now if you do nothing, then what's going to happen is that this track is going to run over the 5 people, going to kill them. But the place where you're standing next to the lever, if you press the lever, the trolley will deviate from the main track and go into the secondary track where only one person is tied, which will then kill only this one person. Through this process, you will save 5 people by killing this one person. Now, will you do that? Now, many people are not comfortable doing this, but many are as well. They think it is worth sacrificing this one person to save 5 people. So more number of people tend to agree to pressing the lever, and from a utilitarian philosophy, that seems to be completely moral thing to do. That's the right thing to do, right? Because you are saving more people even if you have to sacrifice one person. Now, but there's a variation to this problem. When people are presented with this variation, the answer patterns change dramatically. So in the variation to the problem, what happens is that yes, there is still a runaway trolley that is running down a track where there are 5 people tied, but now there is no lever. Instead, you are standing on this elevated platform, on this bridge, and there is this big fat man who is leaning precariously from the bridge. Now all you have to do is give a small nudge to this person, and this person is going to fall on the track because this person is a big fat human being, and the trolley is going to hit this person. This person is of course going to get killed, both from the fall and also from getting hit by the trolley. But through this process, the person is going to stop the trolley from moving further down the lane, and consequently you will be saving those 5 people. Now, are you going to push this person, or are you not going to do that? Now, when we are presented with the problem in this sequence, majority people say no, that's going to be a horrible thing to do. Now, but you realize from a mathematical perspective, these are exactly the same situations. You are sacrificing one person to save 5, but it clearly seems to be a very bad thing, very immoral thing to push somebody on a track and kill to save 5 people. So many things cannot be determined just through mathematical calculations. And this is that classic example of a case where what may seem ethical in one variation becomes completely unethical in another variation, even though the mathematical calculations are exactly the same. Now, there are numerous other examples too that could be shared here, but in interest of time, I probably should not go into all those details. But let me just quickly talk about another example. Imagine you are this physician, this surgeon, who has, let's say, 6 patients on in the hospital. Would it be okay to kill one of those persons, take the organs out of this person, and put them in the remaining 5 patients who are in need of those vital organs? One person may need a heart, another person may need a kidney, another person may need a liver, and so on and so forth. The 4th person may need some other brain or whatever. So by doing this horrible act, you, even though are killing one person, you are saving 5 people. So in terms of the mathematical calculation, it seems like the right thing to do. That's what the utilitarian thinking would say, right? But most of us would say that's going to be the most horrible thing to do, and that's primarily because we should not be using people as means to achieve some bigger end, howsoever noble it may seem. So it may seem fine to use somebody as a means as long as that act is not something too gory, right? But when you are sacrificing people's lives or maybe even harming them physically, or in real life cases, organizations case, when you fire people, maybe 5% of the workforce, just so that the company can make more profits, or that becomes extremely immoral kind of thing to do. So the utilitarian thinking has a lot of demerits as well. But at least by being aware of the different ways through which we come to figuring out whether or not our decision is ethical is a first step in the process of we having greater clarity about how to make more ethical decisions. So you now remember the classification of the different ethical theories that I had been talking about. So what we have gone through are the three teleological theories: ethical egoism, utilitarianism, and altruism. All these theories focused on the consequences of the actions. Now the deontological theories, which is also an action focused or conduct focused theory, these theories, they evaluate the morality of an action not based on their consequences but based on the merits of the action themselves, right? Like the examples that I was sharing before. Killing one person is bad irrespective of how many people I may be saving, right? As a physician, when I do that, that's horrible. So do what is morally right, irrespective of what the consequences are. That's what gets emphasized in the deontological thinking. It is your duty to do what is right, and that's what Immanuel Kant emphasized a lot. So do what's right no matter what is the cost. So there are certain things, and you should not be killing people, you should not be lying, and so on and so forth. So there are certain universal principles that he talks about that are inherently either right or wrong, and what is right is what you should always do irrespective of what is the consequence of those actions. Whether more people are benefited or harmed doesn't matter, you should do what is always right. This is something that gets emphasized tremendously in the Kantian perspective, and Immanuel Kant is considered the greatest moral philosopher in at least the Western tradition, and this theory of categorical imperative, doing what is right, and it is our duty to do what is right irrespective of the consequences, this is something that is emphasized over and over again, and it has had tremendous impact in the field of ethics. And you could imagine this has lot of plus points or lots of advantages over the utilitarian thinking, which is something that becomes too complex. And the Kantian perspective does address many of the weaknesses that exist in the utilitarian thinking. For example, you will say that it is clearly wrong to sacrifice few people for the benefit of others, because this act of killing somebody is inherently wrong, right? But even the Kantian perspective has its demerits. First of all, there are always exceptions that one can find to any law, any rules, the way we could find these situations where utilitarian thinking doesn't work. Similarly, we can find situations where the Kantian model also does not work. One of the examples that come into play is this. Imagine let's say, small child who is running away from a killer, and this small child comes and hides maybe somewhere you could see, and this killer later on comes to you and asks, have you seen this child? uh, should you tell the truth? From the Kantian perspective, one should always tell the truth. Lying is wrong, lying is bad, so one should always tell the truth. But most of us would agree that it would be immoral to reveal the location of this child, right? It would be completely immoral, because we know that the child would then be killed by this person or this group of rowdy mob that is all out to kill this little child, right? So Kant actually argues, when he was given this, describe the situation, he says that no, yes, I will still tell the truth, but I will fight tooth and nail to save the child as well. Now, just because you fight tooth and nail to save the child doesn't mean that you will succeed in saving the child, right? A much more pragmatic thing to do would be to just lie then, because that's how you save the child, right? So there are always exceptions to these rule-bound theories, and this is one classical example of a case where such rule-bound theories fail. That said, the Kantian model still is of tremendous value, because here we are not treating people as a means to a particular end. Every person is an end in itself, and it recognizes the fact that certain actions, especially which are unethical, if everyone starts acting based on those unethical motivations, then we will have a completely disordered, disintegrated society. So that is one of the primary reasons why Kant argues that irrespective of how difficult the situation is, we should always act based on this categorical imperative, which is that it is your duty to do the right thing. Now let's quickly go through some of the other theories, and the other deontological theory which we will quickly go over is the justice perspective. Now, many of you have been exposed to the different justice theories that we have discussed in many other classes. But the basic idea here is that it is our duty to treat people fairly and impartially. It is something that this theory emphasizes, that we should be respecting the rights of all individuals, that we should be upholding the principles of justice, which would include equality, fairness, due process, and so on and so forth. So John Rawls is one of the biggest proponents of the justice theory. So like the Kantian theory, in the justice theory as well, there is the emphasis on doing the right thing. It is our duty to do the right thing, irrespective of what the consequences are. Now, how to figure out what the right thing is from the justice perspective, I won't go into all those details, because this is something that you should have been familiar from your other classes. You would remember the distributive justice theory, the procedural justice theory, the interactional justice theory, the informational justice theory, and so on and so forth. I won't go into all those details. But the basic idea is that the distribution of outcomes should be fair, right? We should not be making any kind of biased distribution of outcomes. It should be based on principles of equity. Many of you may remember the equity theory that either you learned from me or from other professors in the department, that it's not about equal distribution of outcomes. Rather, fairness is achieved when we make sure that the outcome input ratios are equal, right? So it's not an equal distribution of outcomes, but equal distribution of outcomes taking into account the inputs as well. So if somebody has given less inputs, then probably he or she deserves less outcomes as well. But if somebody has put in a lot of effort, lot of inputs, worked hard, probably then that person deserves a greater share of the pie, right? And even animals are sensitive to this. This is something that, there are many examples that I share in my other classes, but in this particular series of photographs, what you see is that the researcher goes to a pair of dogs. The researcher asks for the first dog's paw. The dog, the friendly creatures that they are, happily extends the paw. The researcher does not give the first dog any treat. The researcher goes to the second dog and asks for the second dog's paw. The second dog also extends his paw happily, but the second dog is rewarded by the researcher. Now that obviously makes the first dog really mad, which you can see in this third picture here. When the researcher comes back to the first dog and asks for the first dog's paw again, the dog is mad, won't even look at the researcher, because it's an unfair distribution of outcomes. Both the dogs did the same input, right? That of extending the paw, but one dog was given a reward, other dog was not. So the outcome input ratio got messed up, which then led to a situation of unfairness. So the basic idea is that we should always be fair in the distribution of outcomes. It is our duty to be fair. And again, not just about distribution of outcomes, but also procedure, the various procedures that we use in organizations, the procedural fairness. That is also something that we should make sure that they are fair, and so on and so forth. So it is our duty to be just. It is our duty to be fair. And this is what John Rawls talks about from the justice perspective. Now your textbook does talk about another perspective, which is Dewey's perspective of pragmatism. Now this isn't exactly a theory of ethics, so I won't cover this in much detail here. And essentially the theory is using the idea of truth, using scientific methods to arrive at truth, that particular paradigm in the area of ethics, which may seem like it has a lot of merits, but it then becomes very similar to utilitarian thinking, which we had discussed before. So you are essentially trying to be pragmatic, trying to be practical. So it becomes another one of those consequentialist based idea of ethics, right? So you should not be too caught up in doing just the right thing. You also have to be practical. You have to be practical in the sense that you have to take into account the consequences, whether it is how it is impacting you and others. So you have to be pragmatic, which is the kind of thinking that has already been discussed in the utilitarian thinking. So this is pretty much a redundant theory of ethics, so I won't go into much detail here. But now let's talk about the next major category of ethics theories, which are the character-focused theories of ethics. I am personally the biggest fan of the character-focused theories of ethics. Why? Because it recognizes these theories, especially the biggest theory in the character-focused theory are the virtue ethics. Ethics of care, you could almost consider it as a subcomponent of virtue ethics theory, and you will realize why I'm saying that in a few minutes. But the character-focused theories or the virtue ethics, they talk about the idea of the person being ethical as opposed to an action being ethical or unethical. So we are talking about the person behind the action, not just the action. As you would remember, an action may seem moral, may seem ethical, but the person may be completely unethical. So the intentions behind the person come into play here, right? So and another critical thing is that, based on these conduct focused theories, in terms of whether they are the teleological theories where we determine what is right and wrong based on the consequences of the action, or whether it's the deontological theories where we decide what's right or wrong based on certain principles of what is right and wrong, not based on the consequences. We can decide what's right and wrong, but does it mean that we will always engage in those actions? Maybe not. And often this is something that most people fail to do. We know, for example, from ethical egoism that we should not be smoking because it's harmful to our health. But there's millions of people on this planet who cannot help but smoke, right? We know that it is bad for us to harm others or harm animals, but again there are a lot of people who cannot but help engage in activities that either harm people psychologically or physically, or maybe animals and plants and the environment, right? So we also need to have that character strength where we are succeeding in not succumbing to the temptations of the benefits that would accrue from engaging in certain actions and still do the action that is right. So deontological theory is good. It tells us what is right, what's not, based on certain principles. But do we have that character strength to actually engage in those actions? So that is what is talked about in these character focused theories. So what is emphasized is that we should focus on developing those character traits. If we haven't developed those character traits, even if we know what's right, what's wrong, we will not engage in those right actions. That's what gets emphasized. So, but if we have developed those character traits, then we will certainly be more inclined to, as well as have the capacity to engage in the right actions, in the right moral actions. So when we are talking about virtues, we are talking about these, whole host of character strengths that are considered virtues because they make us stronger human beings. Stronger, again, not just physically, though that could be a small component of it, but from a character perspective, from a personality perspective, it makes us much stronger. So we are much more likely to work in a way that is in consonance with what we want to do, what we ought to do as well. So here are some of the character strengths that are listed in your textbook. It's not an exhaustive list. There can be other strengths as well. Courage is a big component, right? You may know that it's the right thing to do would be to speak up in this organization where everyone else seem to be going in a direction which, based on your evaluation, is unethical. So you know it is unethical. You know you should be speaking up, but many people do not, right? And there are several examples that I've shared about this in my past videos, because they do not have that courage to speak up, right? So it is important that you have developed courage, and this is something like a process of skill development that you do not develop over time. It takes a long time to develop any of these character strengths, be it courage, be it grit, be it temperance, be it any of these character strengths that we are talking about. Grit, for example, is about perseverance and having the passion in the long term. You may be passionate about, let's say, playing the guitar, right? But do you also have the grit or the capacity to persevere even when playing the guitar is being really tough on your fingers, or you are not making enough improvement? Are you being able to sustain that passion when you are not getting attention from others for your guitar playing, or when you are having tremendous amount of difficulties playing your guitar? I'm just giving the example of playing the guitar, but it could apply to anything, right? uh, so we get excited about many things, but do we have the grit to persevere despite obstacles? When we have that kind of character strength, we then will be able to resist the temptations that come into play when we have to say no to choices that are potentially very attractive but actually unethical, right? So that's the reason we emphasize uh, character strength so much. That's the reason this is one of my most favorite theories. And lo and behold, this is one of the oldest theories, although it hasn't been discussed as much as some of the other theories like utilitarianism and deontological ethics. So this goes back to, in the Western tradition, goes back to Aristotle, who talked a lot about virtue ethics. In the Eastern tradition, it goes back even older. But I won't go into all those details here, but everything that is mentioned here, temperance is about having that proper balance where you are not going into extremes. So doing things in moderation. Many people do not have that capacity. They haven't developed that capacity, rather, would be the appropriate way of saying it. So they then either overindulge in their vices, or they try to keep themselves away from some of the vices, and they keep swinging back and forth between these vices, so which doesn't help them or their family or the community in which they live, right? Wisdom, wisdom again is not just about having intelligence, but having that moral wisdom where you have the discriminatory power to figure out what is the right thing to do, what's not the right thing to do. So all these things that we discussed in terms of utilitarian thinking or deontological thinking, they have merits. All these thinking, thoughts, processes, perspectives have merits, but in certain situations they do not work, right? So having that wisdom to figure out where to apply utilitarian thinking, where not to apply, where to apply deontological thinking, Kantian model, where not to apply, where to apply the justice perspective, where not to apply. That's something that comes with wisdom. Many people who lack in wisdom, they go by this rule-based approach, irrespective of what's happening, the practical aspects. They do not take all those contexts into account. They just go by the rule book. The rule book says this person has to be fired, so they fire. The rule book says this is what you ought to do, so they do it, which actually may be completely immoral, and so on and so forth. I don't necessarily have to go through all these character strengths in great detail because they tend to be self-explanatory, but I hope you understand. And when we are talking about justice here, we are not talking about it from the perspective of the duty that we have to be just. That is something that was discussed in the justice perspective, which is the deontological theory. Here we are talking about developing the capacity to be just, right? And that is again something that you develop over a period of time. So it's not just about arguing for just people, just behavior, just outcomes from others, but developing the capacity where you are being able to make just decisions for yourself and for others. Optimism. Many people are not as optimistic. They are extremely pessimistic to the point of being cynical. And again, here you realize that that can have strong detrimental effects on people, on organizations. So having an optimistic perspective can be a very ethical thing to do. Can be very ethical perspective to hold, because you give people a sense of hope, a sense of motivation to work towards accomplishing the things that you want to accomplish. Integrity is something again that is of critical importance. Integrity is what? You walk the talk. You do not just talk the talk. So there is high consonance between what you say and what you do. That is what integrity is. And this is something again that not all of us have, and even if we have it, that is something that we can develop more. We can have stronger integrity than we have currently. So these are character strengths that you have to work hard to develop. You have to work hard to keep your word consistently over long periods of time to be able to develop that high level of integrity. Humility, again, I won't necessarily re-emphasize this, because you have heard me talking about humility in many of my other lectures, including in the series of lectures that I am making on the ethical aspect of leadership, because it is in a way just the opposite of narcissism. So if narcissism leads to unethical actions, unethical decisions, humility, being humble, can be something that is extremely good, because we are not becoming so ego invested in our thoughts, in our decisions, in our actions. We are staying humble, and there's a lot of research that has gone into this. The last point, being compassionate. This may seem similar to altruism, because we are taking care of others, we have concern for others. But here we are talking about compassion from a character strength point of view. It is not easy to be compassionate, to be kind, to be generous, to be loving towards others. That is something that we also have to develop from when we are talking about altruism from the perspective that we had discussed before. We were trying to figure out whether a particular action is altruistic or not based on the consequences of those actions. Here we are not talking about that. Here we are talking about developing that compassionate attitude. We are talking about having that temperament where you are being more generous, you are being more kind towards people, and this is something that you have to work hard to develop, right? So when I said that ethic of care could be considered part of virtue ethics, because it essentially emphasizes this compassionate aspect of the virtue ethics. So in virtue ethics, there's a series of whole series of virtues that get emphasized. In ethic of care, it's the compassion part, the kindness part that is emphasized the most. So that's the reason I said that ethic of care could be considered a subcomponent of the virtue ethics. But it has its distinct place in the literature because of historical reasons. It came from the feminist perspective. So there were some women theorists of ethics who found the various flaws in the utilitarian thinking, in the deontological thinking, and they emphasized the importance of compassionate approach, compassionate thinking, and how women, primarily because of their personality differences with men, generally tend to be more compassionate. They tend to, if you remember my lectures on personality traits, they tend to on an average be higher on the agreeable dimension than men. So naturally they tend to be more compassionate, more kind than men on an average again. But what is emphasized in the ethic of care is the aspect of developing this empathetic attitude, developing this compassionate attitude. So the important thing about all these character focused theories, which are the virtue focused theories, is that it takes a lot of hard work to develop these character traits. You may have to go through a lot of hardship. Sometimes when things are going easy for you, you do not actually develop these character traits, these character strengths. Often you develop these character strengths after having gone through difficulties yourself. That's how then you become attuned to the suffering of others. That's how you become more compassionate. When you fail, that's how you develop the process of grit, right? You fail, but you still decide to persist. So then you have to go through failure. If you're always succeeding, then you will not develop the character strength of grit, right? So the one time that you fail, you may give up because you have never had failures in your life. When you have faced dangerous situations, again, by dangerous I'm not necessarily meaning physical danger. It could be a danger to your career, right? When you have faced various dangerous situations in your life, and you dealt with those situations with varying amounts of courage, that's how you develop the character strength of courage, and so on and so forth. So the character focused approach is a much more difficult approach. It takes time to develop like any other skill, but it is my favorite approach to ethics because it has the most sustainable impact on people's lives. It's almost like developing habits. Your textbook talks about the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, but there are many other great books on developing habits. Some of the newer ones which are exceptionally great is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Then there is the other book, Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, that came a few years before. And then another book that comes to mind is Eat the Frog by Brian Tracy, where he emphasizes the habit of doing the most difficult thing, the first thing in the day, which then makes things easy for the rest of the day. In any case, the point of I emphasizing the importance of developing habits is that developing good habits is that you develop character strength, which then makes you a better leader, a more competent leader, a more ethical leader. And people have varying amounts of character strengths in different virtues. So we need to develop where we have strengths, and we also need to address where we have weaknesses. We need to strengthen some of the areas where we may not have as much of strength in those virtues, because they can then become fatal flaws. So in any case, that's all that I wanted to discuss when it came to the idea of the different perspectives that we have about ethics. Now, this lecture spanned multiple chapters. They were not from one single chapter in your textbook, but this lecture should provide you a complete overview of the most important theories of ethics that exist. I will probably do just one more small lecture to describe the implications of these different theories in connection to the different leadership theories. That will be a very short lecture. But other than that, once you have a good perspective of all these ethical theories, and again, just having the perspective of all these different theories, learning about all these different theories is not enough, as especially is emphasized in the character focused theories of ethics or in the virtue ethics, right? Just knowing about these different theories is not enough. We have to develop that character. We have to work hard to develop these strengths within us so that we can and we will act in the most ethical manner possible. That's it. Thank you.